Join me today as I drag home this old propane tank and see if I can transform it into an 11-foot roller for the Field of Dreams. So, due to the wonderful scrounging abilities of Dean, we've been able to find this wonderful big chunk of steel. So it's a propane tank, or it used to be at one time, and now it's about to become a roller for my runway. So the one end is wide open, this end is going to need to be cut off. We have a hemispherical end to cut off, so that's going to be task number one. There's a couple of feet on there that got to come off, but nothing, a little bit of cut and torch and grinder, and we'll get at her. And I'm going to square up the ends, cap them, figure out some way of putting some bearings on the end and build a framework for it so I can tow it behind the tractor, and then fill it to varying degrees of weight by adding or draining water from it. So that's the plan. It's definitely doable. And so here we go. Got the torch fired up and time to start cutting. So I was far less apprehensive of cutting into a propane tank with an acetylene torch, knowing that the other end had already been opened up and was wide open. It was more difficult to cut than I anticipated, and it wasn't until after I got the end off I could see what I was cutting through. It turns out there were 2 layers of steel at the seam I chose to make my cut at. Having the overhead gantry made life much easier. Even though it's kind of a pain in the butt to move around the shop by myself, I don't think I could have done this job without it. So after cutting all the way around and some gentle persuasion with a sledgehammer, the end cap finally comes off. A little bit of torching and a little bit of chiseling and maybe a little bit of swearing. I managed to get this hemisphere off of the end of the tank. It was a little bit of a challenge because as you can see, it's a double wall where I was cutting, so it was making it a little interesting trying to cut. So this ugly cut here will get cleaned up, and then I will make a plate for the end. Still have to remove these guys, and there's a lifting lug over on this side here somewhere, right about there. That's got to go, and of course we'll clean the inside out a little bit, and we'll start capping the ends. The next thing to go were the feet. They were both cut off and tossed in the scrap bin, and then it was time to square up that end cut that I'd made. So in order to get a nice straight edge on this, I wanted a guide or something to guide my torch. So I got a small piece of, looks like about a 1-inch by 2 flat bar. The straight edge served as a guide for the torch to make a nice straight cut. And as the folks at Obsession Motorsports would say, time to get the funk up. There's one end squared up, all round again, so that's a good sign. Well, one of the things that this thing's going to need to do is hold water, so that's going to be hard with a big hole in it. So, big hole there, so we're going to have to weld that up. And just like that, hole be gone. Then it was time to start the end caps. After squaring this edge off nice and straight, so I got a straight edge to work with, I had to weld up. There was a couple of holes in the panel there, so I had to weld them up, just fill them up with some weld, and then draw out the rough shape of the diameter of the pipe there. So I got this piece pretty much ready to put it in place and start fitting. So I'm trying to keep the costs down, so I'm just using some steel that I had kind of laying around the place. There was a few sheets of steel. It means I'm going to have to put the end cap on in 2 pieces, but a little bit of welding is going to take a little extra time, but it's going to save me
a whole bunch of money than trying to buy some plate. One of the drawbacks of using old steel is rust, and there was plenty of it on there. I had to grind off all that rust to find a nice clean surface, so I had something good to weld to.
The only way I could accurately mark that plate, because it's going on the inside, was to actually get inside. Crawl inside. And yeah, it's kind of dark in here, but there's my chalk line in there. Yeah, so it's a good thing. It's a good thing that that pipe's as big as it is.
Grab some cardboard here to do a little CAD engineering and make a template for the last little piece of the end cap. Then it was time for a quick cleanup of the shop and do the other end. Something else I was going to need to do was make some holes in this so I could fill it and drain the water out of it. So on each end there are some large pipe fittings welded into the end to provide a place to fill and dump the water out of it. Time to clean up the shop after a long day of fabricating. We'll get back at her tomorrow.
So it's back to working on the roller. Now that I've got these, I've still got a little bit of thinking to do to get that sorted out, to figure out how I'm going to attach this to the tractor. Other projects have been set aside or put away or on the back burner for a little bit, and it's time for the roller to get front and center, get back some attention on this, get this thing going. So I've got the ends, the drums capped now and pressure tested. Seems to be fairly leak-proof. So the next step is to give it something to roll on. These are spindles off of some sort of farm implement. There was just an axle actually over at the property I got next door. There was a bunch of scrap there when we bought the place. So one of the things I found, there was this axle with these spindles on it. So I think I'm going to try and utilize these spindles. So the idea is to center them in the drum. Build some brackets there to give it a little bit of strength. It's time to get back at the roller. It's all sorted out, flattened out. So I've measured to find the center point, and I've got a center punch mark on there, and I've scribed a bigger circle there just to have something to measure from. Scribe in the paint here. Size of the hole. And I don't have to get this hole perfect because of my plan is once the hole is made that this fits in. This is the part that was part of the axle. This actually slides through there. Just fits in there tickety-boo. So I'm gonna clean this up, and it'll get, once we find our center spot, that'll get welded into place. Then the tricky bit is getting it square to the rest of the roller. If it's not perfectly in the center, it's not the end of the world. If it's not perfectly in the center, because it'll just kind of do this a little bit. It'll be like the wheel on a clown car, but other than that, if it's not straight, if I have this going on, then that stress is going to transfer through the tow bar, and it'll just end up breaking or cracking or getting that square perpendicular to this plate and to the roller itself. That's essential.
So it's time to cut a hole in the center of my new end cap, and then clean it up with a grinder and get the die grinder out and fit it to the spindle. Had to fit pretty close to get in there, and here it is fitted. So now it's ready to put my doubler on there. So once I get it all lined up, I'll have the doubler there, and that'll give me a little extra strength at the center where that's going to join on. But first I have to get it square and tacked into the end. So measure, 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 tack, tack, measure, measure, and measure again. And then once you think you got it square, go back to the toolbox, grab another square, and measure, measure, measure some more. Then I measured from the outside to the center of the spindle, fine-tuned that a little bit, and I'm pretty happy with where it is there, so that's where it's going to stay. So there's the spindle centered and square with the doubler in place. Next step was to fabricate some gussets. So I made 4 gussets for each spindle and welded them around at every 90 degrees to add some strength there. I'm pretty sure that ain't going to break. That's about as strong as I can make it. And now that's all welded up, grab some zinc chromate just to give it a treatment there so it doesn't rust. And here is the other end all done. So with the magic of modern editing, you don't have to watch me weld both sides, but there's the spindles attached. Next phase is to hang the hubs on there and start fabricating something for the drawbar. Now initially I thought I might use the old rims as a attach point for the drawbar, but I decided against that and I went with this little setup here. So it's a piece of 1/2 inch plate that I've cut to shape and drilled to match the bolt holes for the studs on the old spindle, and then some 2-inch heavy wall tubing. And same over on this side. It was at this point that I realized that the hubs were of different sizes. One was an 8 stud and the other was a 6 stud, but for the purposes of what we're doing here today, it will work just fine. Then with the rest of the 2-inch heavy wall tubing, I fabricated the drawbar, put a couple of gussets on there, and put an end on there to hook to the tractor. And just like that, my 11-foot roller was built. So stay tuned when I get it out to the Field of Dreams here and we start actually putting it to work.